The house on Marrowbone Lane. In the fall of 2019, the Carter family, Mark, Julie, and their two kids, 12-year-old Ethan and 8-year-old Lily, decided they'd had enough of city life. Mark worked remotely as a software developer, and Julie was a freelance illustrator, so they weren't tethered to Cincinnati anymore. They wanted quiet space, a place where the kids could run around without neighbors complaining about the noise. After months of scrolling through real estate listings, they found it. A 3-bedroom farmhouse on 14 acres of wooded land outside a small town called Harrow's Bend, Kentucky. The price was suspiciously low, $142,000 for a house that size, with a barn and a creek running through the property. But the listing said it just needed some TLC. The photos showed peeling paint and overgrown weeds, but the bones of the place looked solid. They figured they could fix it up over time. The realtor, a wiry guy named Dale with a thick Kentucky drawl, met them at the end of Marrowbone Lane, a gravel track that wound through dense pine and oak trees. He seemed nice enough, though he chain-smoked the whole time he showed them around. The house itself was old, built in 1892, he said, but it had character. High ceilings, a wraparound porch, and a big stone fireplace in the living room. The floors creaked underfoot, and the air smelled faintly of mildew. But Mark and Julie saw potential. Ethan was thrilled about the woods to explore, and Lily kept pointing at the barn, asking if they could get a horse. Dale didn't say much about the house's history, just that it had been empty for a while after the last owner passed away. Folks around here don't like fixer-uppers, he shrugged. They signed the papers that week. The move happened in early November, right as the leaves were turning brittle and the days got short. The first few weeks were chaotic, unpacking boxes, patching leaks in the roof, figuring out why the well pump kept cutting out. But it wasn't until the third week that Julie noticed something off. She'd been sketching in the kitchen one night, the kids asleep upstairs, when she heard footsteps on the porch. Not the usual groan of old wood settling, distinct, heavy steps, like someone pacing. She grabbed a flashlight and peeked out the window, but there was nothing. No deer, no raccoons, just the wind rustling the trees. Mark checked the next morning and found no tracks in the muddy yard. They chalked it up to fatigue. Then Ethan started talking about the cold spot in his room. It was a corner near his closet, he said, where the air always felt icy, even with the radiator cranked up. He'd wake up some nights and see his breath fogging in the dark. Mark borrowed a thermal camera from a buddy at work and tested it. Sure enough, that corner read 48 degrees when the rest of the room was 70. He figured it was a draft and stuffed some insulation in the wall, but Ethan swore it didn't help. It's like someone standing there, he'd say, his voice small. Julie laughed it off at first, but she stopped when she caught Lily staring at that same corner one afternoon, whispering, "Who are you?" When Julie asked who she was talking to, Lily just said, "The man." Mark wasn't the type to believe in ghosts. He grew up in a practical family. His dad was a mechanic, his mom a nurse, and he'd always rolled his eyes at haunted house nonsense. But even he couldn't explain the scratches. They showed up one morning on the underside of the kitchen table, deep gouges in the wood, like someone had dragged a knife across it. The table was a heavy oak piece they'd brought from Cincinnati, and no one in the family owned anything sharp enough to do that kind of damage. Ethan and Lily denied touching it, and Julie pointed out the obvious. The scratches were on the underside, where the kids couldn't even reach without crawling. Mark sanded them out and didn't talk about it again, but Julie noticed he started locking the bedroom door at night. By December, the little things were piling up. Doors they'd closed would be ajar in the morning. The faucet in the upstairs bathroom would turn on by itself, never a flood, just a slow drip that left rust stains in the sink. Once, Julie found a stack of her sketches rearranged on the dining room table, all flipped to drawings of the house she'd done from the porch. She hadn't touched them in days. The family started sleeping closer together, Ethan and Lily dragging their blankets into their parents' room some nights, saying they didn't like the whispering they heard through the walls. It wasn't loud, they said, just a low murmur, like someone talking in another room. Mark set up a baby monitor in the hallway to prove it was nothing, but the first night, it picked up static, and beneath it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on glass. They might have brushed it all off as imagination if it weren't for the photograph. Julie had taken a picture of the kids playing in the snow near the barn one afternoon. It was a cloudy day, the light flat and gray, but when she looked at the photo later on her phone, there was a figure in the upstairs window. Not a shadow or a reflection, a person, blurry but distinct, standing in Ethan's room. The head was tilted slightly, like it was watching them. Julie zoomed in until the pixels broke apart, but she couldn't make out a face. She showed Mark, and for the first time, he didn't have an explanation. They'd all been outside when she took the shot. That's when Julie started digging. She drove into Harrow's Bend one Saturday and spent the afternoon at the county library, a squat brick building with flickering fluorescent lights. The librarian, an older woman named Marjorie, who smelled like lavender and mothballs, helped her pull property records and old newspapers. What Julie found made her stomach twist. The house on Marrowbone Lane had belonged to a man named Edwin Purcell, a widower who'd lived there alone from the 1940s until his death in 1997. He'd been a recluse, rarely seen in town, and the papers hinted at something darker. A 1982 article mentioned a missing girl, 14-year-old Clara Hensley, last seen walking near the property. She was never found, and though Purcell was questioned, there wasn't enough evidence to charge him. Another clipping from 1997 reported his death, found in the barn, hanging from a rafter, no note. The coroner ruled it a suicide, but locals whispered he'd been driven to it. Marjorie leaned over Julie's shoulder as she read, muttering. Folks said that place was cursed long before Edwin. Bad land, bad history. Julie didn't tell Mark everything right away. She didn't want to scare the kids, but she started pushing to move. Mark resisted. They'd sunk their savings into the house, and he wasn't ready to admit defeat over a few weird noises. But then came the night that changed his mind. It was January 4th, a bitter cold snap gripping the woods. The power went out around 9 p.m., leaving them huddled by the fireplace with blankets and a battery-powered lantern. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside, it was dead quiet until Lily screamed. She was staring at the staircase, her eyes wide, pointing. He's there. He's there, she sobbed. Julie grabbed her, and Mark shone the lantern up the steps. At first, they saw nothing, just the dark landing at the top. Then Ethan whimpered, and Julie followed his gaze. Something moved. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. A figure, tall and thin, descending the stairs one slow step at a time. The lantern caught the edge of it. A pale hand gripping the banister, knuckles sharp and white. No face, no sound, just that hand and the faint creak of the wood. Mark shouted, "Who's there?" But his voice cracked. The figure stopped halfway down, motionless, and then it was gone. Not like it walked away, just gone. They didn't sleep that night. At dawn, Mark called Dale and told him to list the house. They packed what they could fit in the car and drove to a motel in town, leaving most of their furniture behind. Dale sold the place 3 months later to some out-of-state investor who planned to flip it. The Carters never went back, not even to pick up the stuff they'd left. Julie says she still has nightmares about that hand on the banister, and Ethan refuses to sleep without a light on. Lily doesn't talk about it at all. She just draws the same thing over and over. A man standing in a window watching. Last I heard, the house is still standing on Marrowbone Lane. The new owner put it back on the market last year after living there 6 weeks. The listing doesn't mention Edwin Purcell or Clara Hensley or the Carters. It just says motivated seller. If you drive by, locals say, you can sometimes see a light flicker in the upstairs window, even though the power's been cut for months.